evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all. Let's begin another one of our delightful conversations. For me, these have been truly enjoyable, so I imagine you are also appreciating them as we discuss the articles by Professor JOSÉ CARLOS FERNÁNDEZ, our director at New Acropolis in Portugal. Today, we'll talk about something that, well, I don't know much about, and I don't know anyone who has ever spoken to me about it. So, I believe this is a little-known topic in our country, which is the correspondence between Saint Paul and Seneca. These letters, which for many centuries have generally been considered apocryphal, that is, not authentic, have, over time and with more detailed examination, shown some variations in this assessment, as has often happened throughout history. I have already spoken with you here, for example, about two texts. We have these two lectures on YouTube about two things that in the past were considered apocryphal and that, suddenly, ceased to be. Just as a detail, what does apocryphal mean? It refers to something that is attributed to someone, but was not actually created by that person. In other words, it is false in relation to that author. So, for example, I have already spoken to you about Plato's seventh letter. This seventh letter, like all the other letters, was considered apocryphal for a long time, and at a certain point it was no longer considered so. It began to be regarded as legitimate, and today it is considered authentic. Another lecture I also gave you was about the Delphic maxims. These Delphic maxims were considered a legend for a long time, until historical evidence was found proving that they really did exist. And today, they are recognized as true. Troy, for example, until Schliemann went there and proved that Troy existed, it was considered nothing more than a Homeric legend. Therefore, many things require from us flexibility and intelligence, so that we do not label or dismiss something prematurely. Many things have been regarded as false, 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 until one day we discover we were mistaken. It was actually true. This should serve as a lesson for us to be more flexible when we look at something and say, this is apocryphal, this is false, this has no value whatsoever. Many things that were once considered apocryphal are now recognized as legitimate. And I would like to share with you, following the text by Professor JOSÉ CARLOS FERNÁNDEZ, a bit about these letters, their context, and the content of the letters themselves, what they say. Shall we begin? So, here we have two historical figures of great significance. On one side, Paul of Tarsus, Saint Paul, apocryphal. Apostle in all the titles he is given in our time, he is a great builder of Christianity, the one who spread Christianity throughout the ancient world in his era. And he was an indispensable figure in this role. Saint Paul lived from 5 to 67 AD, and for a significant period, especially toward the end of his life, the conclusion of his life is something that has many disagreements, even within patristic studies. There were those who said he was beheaded in Rome, and others who claimed he went to Hispania. In other words, even on this point, there is some controversy. But the truth is that, at a certain point in his life, he arrived in Rome and remained a prisoner there, precisely at the moment when the consul, advisor, and tutor to Emperor Nero was Seneca. And Lucius Annaeus Seneca lived from 4 BC until 65 AD. So, the lives of the two have dates that are very close, running in parallel. Seneca, from a philosophical perspective, needs no introduction. He is the great name of Stoicism. It is a school that, above all, is moral, addressing ethics as the source of happiness, and focusing on the harmonization of laws, on the conduct of humanity in accordance with the laws of nature. And Seneca is a major exponent of this philosophy. Seneca had a very turbulent life, and he was appointed by Agrippina as the tutor of the young Nero, raising and educating Nero, and made him an excellent emperor from the time he assumed the throne at 17 until the age of 24. At that point, Nero loses his sanity, kills his own mother, and begins to commit numerous atrocities, and ultimately, he falsely accuses Seneca himself of being a traitor and condemns him. And he sentences him to commit suicide by cutting his own wrists in a bathtub. In short, it is a very sad story, and Seneca's works remain as testimony to the greatness of his thought. A truly great Stoic philosopher. In other words, two great men, both with a very interesting focus. Moral precepts of tremendous beauty, inspired by an understanding of the value of divine laws in the world. Inspired by the perception of a need to order the earth in a way that mirrors the laws of nature, in a way that reflects the laws of the heavens. It is said, then, that at a certain point, the writings of Paul would have reached Seneca. So Paul arrives at the port of Pozzuoli in what is now Italy. And during the time of Nero, at a time when he was still a good emperor. To give you an idea, for those who know a bit of history, those first 7 years of Nero's reign are often compared to the reign of Augustus, Octavian Augustus, which is considered an excellent period of the empire. So, at the beginning, he was very good, very thoughtful, as long as he followed the guidance of his tutors. At a certain point, however, it seems that the worst aspects of his character came to the surface. He felt betrayed by his own mother, who was plotting to remove him from power, and he killed her, a truly mad, reckless act. From that point on, he began to commit increasingly greater acts of madness, even against Rome itself, going so far as to set the city on fire. We are all somewhat familiar with the stories of Nero's madness. So, we'll talk a little about these letters, or epistles. There are 14 letters. It is said that they exchanged these letters between the years 58 and 64 AD, which was the period when Paul was in Rome. He was a prisoner, awaiting trial, waiting for the resolution of his case. So, these letters are situated within that time frame. There would be 14 letters, if my memory serves me right, 7. 8 letters from Seneca and 6 from Paul in response. And this is the collection of letters that we'll be discussing today. Some of the thinkers who, throughout history, have studied these letters often say the following: at the moment when Christianity began to grow, with the advent of Christianity through Paul, Christianity was limited to very few people, dissidents from the Jewish religion, a very small group, still. Stoicism was much more widespread. Stoicism was almost the official philosophy of Rome, and it was much older. It dates back to 300 BC, with Zeno. In other words, at that time, it was very interesting to associate the name of Seneca with that of Paul. This is what those who deny the authenticity of the letters say. So, according to them, this union would have been made in those early moments of the Church. But later, when the Church prevails and comes to have much more power than Stoicism, many of the fathers, from the patristic period, which is the original, many of them begin to deny the originality of these letters, the authenticity of these letters. So there are both detractors and defenders. Those who usually question the authenticity of the letters say that there was a play of convenience involved. At first, it was advantageous to associate with Stoicism, but later on, it no longer was. Stoicism had a very prominent name and held great importance within that historical context. Fortunately, today, we are once again beginning to understand the value of this philosophical school. It was so significant during a relatively long period of history. This extends all the way to Marcus Aurelius, from 121 to 180 AD, and goes back even further, to 300 BC, with Zeno. In other words, it had a relatively long lifespan, and it was the official way of thinking, the strongest and most prevailing philosophy during those times in Rome. Well, as I was saying to you, the moral and ethical identification found in the beautiful epistles of Paul evidently could not, assuming now the possibility of the authenticity of these letters, fail to move a man of Seneca's greatness. What the letters reveal is precisely this: a Seneca deeply moved by the greatness and beauty of the epistles from that unknown Roman who had been imprisoned for spreading a new religion. A new one. He is captivated by these texts, even saying that he went so far as to read them to Nero. He mentions this himself in the epistles, assuming, of course, that these letters are authentic. In other words, two men with very different backgrounds, with very different life journeys, who are momentarily united by a single point. a love for the laws of the universe as they apply to human nature, a love for ethics, a love for morality. And now, I will share with you a bit about the ecclesiastical representatives of the patristic period who reference these letters. We'll see that the appearance, even of the letters, the epistles in written form, only happens in the 9th century. For some reason, starting in the 800s, they begin to appear in several versions, in fact, not essentially different, but with slightly different wording. But already in the 4th century, in the 300s, there was a man, a Catholic priest of the early church, who was Jerome, who later became a saint, Saint Jerome. He lived from 345 to 420 AD. And at a certain point, he speaks about these letters. In other words, in the 300s, he talks about these letters. I even brought for you all an excerpt from his book, which is De Viris Illustribus, that is, on illustrious men. And he says the following in a passage from this book. Someone whom I would not place on a list of saints, he speaks of Seneca, if it were not for the epistles of Paul to him, and from him back, which are read by many. In those letters, written when he was Nero's tutor and the most powerful man of his time, he says that he should have among his compatriots a place like the one Paul holds among Christians. So, imagine this, a priest from the early church in the 4th century, Jerome, at a certain point says, many people know these letters and have for quite some time. He mentions this here, that they are read by many. Consider that this is a historical moment when the spread of information is not fast. There are no means of communication, nor means of transportation that are very efficient. Everything spreads very slowly. For something to be read by many, how long must it have been spreading? I do not know what he considered to be many. But as he was a man who traveled from place to place preaching the gospel, it is likely that he saw this in more than one location. How long does it take for information to spread so widely in the 4th century AD? It is likely that it dates back much earlier than that. So, the first written work that explicitly cites the letters comes from the De Viris Illustribus by Saint Jerome. Manuscripts, as I mentioned to you, that have been found, we have only discovered so far from the century. That is, from the 800s onward. Now, prior to that, there is no explicit citation of these letters, but there are references to Seneca by certain church fathers, such as, for example, Tertullian, who lived between 160 and 240 AD, who, in his 8 steps, mentions the name or the text of Seneca in the book De Anima. Seneca, at times, is referred to as ours. In other words, it is as if Seneca had already been with us, with Christianity, at some point. This suggests a perception of closeness between Seneca and Christianity. Is this due to his message or because of the epistles? This is something that is difficult for us to know. In other words, to call Seneca ours for someone who was defending Christianity during a still hostile and challenging time, at the very least, shows a certain sympathy based on something quite concrete. We know that the teachings are often very similar. But is that all there is to it? Or was there a foundation in those epistles that he might also have come into contact with? Another case, wealthy Cyprian, who lived from 200 to 258, and who used Seneca's phrases to express his own Christian thought. To defend Christianity, he drew upon Seneca's words, because Seneca was considered acceptable for a Christian. In a time when everything seemed so threatening, anything that was not eminently Christian. What gave those early church fathers, in such a distant era, the confidence to quote a philosopher? To quote a philosopher as, in some way, being connected to their beliefs and their faith. To proceed, we may have some indications that are not proof, but should not be disregarded either. Lactantius, between 240 and 320, said that this man, ignorant of the true religion, could very well have embraced Christianity, referring to Seneca. So you can see that by the 3rd century, Even a little earlier, there were many Christian sympathizers of Seneca. This is an interesting curiosity. The apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, which must have been composed between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, speak of the deeds of Paul at the court of Nero. In other words, they describe how Paul would have interacted with Nero's court in his efforts to continue his missionary work. Well, if Paul interacted with Nero's court, who was the voice of Nero's court at the time he was there? A prisoner? It was Seneca. So this interaction would necessarily have involved Seneca. There could not have been any other possibility. Well, in any case, I did some research and found monographs, texts, and many scholars who oppose, and sometimes even show a certain disdain for these epistles, considering them clearly apocryphal. But at this historical moment, as always happens, there are already one or two people who begin to question. Science can never become dogma. It is simply the best we have so far. In other words, if there is a small detail that we have not yet examined, it is in the very nature of the scientific spirit to go and check the exception, not to simply conform to the rule. And Professor José Carlos Pessoa mentioned something very interesting at a congress held in Milan in 1999 about Seneca and Christianity. An emeritus professor of Christian history from La Sapienza University in Rome, a professor named Maria Grazia Maria, in the presentation of her work, argued several points that lead us to consider a strong possibility that these letters may have some authenticity. She goes on to analyze the style of the letters. Even though it is known that these letters must have undergone many manipulations, something of the original style has remained. And she points out certain elements that would be difficult for a forger to replicate, especially a forger from that era. We'll see that as early as the 4th century, that is, the early 300s, these letters were already known. So, if there was a forger, it would have to have been before that time. She will first point out that, when you observe the way Paul expresses himself, he uses language that leans more toward Hellenic than Latin, including expressions that were not common in Latin. Whereas Seneca expresses himself much more in Latin, with a distinctly Latin vocabulary. And she will consider, and I believe this is quite reasonable for us to consider, that the cultural level that existed. Up until that moment, the cultural level among Christians was not so high as to allow them to create a forgery with such sophistication. To be able to notice the subtle differences in how someone with a Greek background expresses themselves compared to someone with a Latin background, and to incorporate that into such a brief, concise dialogue. So, this is a possibility, a stylistic element that is quite significant. The style of Paul's responses is much more aligned with Greek then, whereas Seneca's statements are much more rooted in Latin. In fact, within the content of the letters, Seneca even criticizes Paul. He points out Paul's need to express his message in Latin, in a better, more refined way, let's say, in a more aesthetic, more presentable manner, worthy of the message he was conveying. Another point she draws attention to, of course, everyone, this is a work that was presented at a conference, and it is much more extensive. Professor José Carlos selected just 3 elements, simply so that we could grasp the idea. This shows how essential it is to pay close attention in order to conduct serious scientific work. To examine details and nuances, not to overlook inconsistencies, because behind these small details, sometimes you discover a whole universe of possibilities. And this professor did exactly that. She refers to an expression at a certain moment in Seneca's work where he speaks of this enthusiasm and inspiration of Paul as being characteristic of the timor deorum, that is, the fear of the gods. Fear in the sense of this inner agitation, this almost ecstatic state in the presence of the divine. If you consider that this might have been the work of early Christians, trying to show that Seneca was converting to Christianity, why use timor deorum? Fear of the gods, and not fear of God. If Christianity, from its very beginnings, has always been monotheistic, why would this expression be placed in Seneca's mouth? Timor deorum, that is, fear of the gods and not fear of God. Notice that these are small details, but they really don't make much sense. Because one of the arguments often made by Christians throughout history is that Paul supposedly converted Seneca to Christianity. That Paul, at a certain point, the 14th letter, would have been the moment of Seneca's conversion to Christianity. And this 14th letter, along with the 12th, are now proven to be apocryphal. They are the only ones that have been definitively challenged. In fact, the style is quite different. So, this is yet another point, a small detail. Notice how interesting this is. This refinement inherent to the scientific method is also a philosophical refinement. By observing small details, we sometimes discover many things that offer us a new perspective on the same subjects. By noticing minor inconsistencies, by not overlooking things, by not simply accepting ready-made versions, but by having the refinement to see the details. From this, at times, we gain a great deal. And this is how good science and good philosophy are made. And a third and final point, which is mentioned in this professor's presentation, is that when Seneca refers to Poppaea Sabina, who is Nero's second wife, he addresses her as the lady. It seems that Poppaea Sabina had connections with Judaism and was upset with Paul for having betrayed his religion and was creating a heresy, something of that sort. When Nero refers to this, he says, "The lady may be angry with you, the lady may be displeased." Considering that, for Christians, the image of Poppaea Sabina, who truly did not like Paul, was not at all favorable, why would Christians who supposedly forged these letters refer to Poppaea Sabina as the lady? And not as Poppaea or Sabina, or by any other name? Why this respectful reference that, at that time, Seneca had for his emperor and empress? And, at that moment, he still had complete trust in her. Why would someone preserve this form of address? A respectful treatment toward a woman for whom Christianity never had much sympathy, never liked? In short, a series of small details like these, Professor José Carlos highlights these three elements. This work, I will try to find it, because it must contain many other interesting things. But it shows that we have already begun to move from that phase of "it doesn't exist" to another phase. Yes, it exists. In the middle, there is, maybe it exists. Perhaps there is truth in this. Shall we start looking at it more seriously? We can no longer ignore it as we have. Let us begin to look at it more seriously. And the style may not be very good, but that is not a sufficient reason to deny anything. I don't know how many things in history we would have to reject simply because the style is not very good. In other words, whatever reason is given for this, it is not enough to completely deny or refuse to examine a historical document. Because it is a historical document, whether apocryphal or not, it is something that was written before the 4th century. In other words, it is something that is at least 16 centuries old. 17? That is to say, it is a historical document. Therefore, it is worthwhile to examine it more closely in its details. Well, as I mentioned to you, the 12th and 14th are considered to be truly false letters. They refer to events that did not happen in that way, so probably there was either a complete forgery or a very crude manipulation of these two letters for certain interests. That's it. In fact, we have to conclude that there may be something original, but that, along with the original, there are also manipulations, as happens with almost every ancient text. And it is very delicate to seek what is true amid so much manipulation. Seeking the truth in any method or on any level is always an arduous task. It is about searching for what is amid what is not. This has a very interesting philosophical aspect. And now, let us turn to the translation of these epistles by M.R. James, who was the translator used by Professor José Carlos. Once again, I remind you all, seek out the original text, which is very interesting and very beautiful. In fact, on the Portugal page, you will find not only this text and the previous three, but also a series of very interesting texts authored by him. And here, he then goes on to cite the epistles. Evidently, Paula, they are the 12th and the 14th. If you wish, Professor José Carlos transcribes both, but I will skip them here because they are not central to the main point. And indeed, they are quite removed from what we intend to analyze here. We'll see then, let us get to know these epistles. Here, you can see that there is a straightforward communication about the situation that both were experiencing at the time. The purpose of these letters was not to deliver grand virtuous sermons, nor to leave a legacy for the future, but rather to serve as a simple exchange between two men who recognized each other as great individuals, both in service of something far greater than themselves. Therefore, these are communications, but quite confined to that particular time, simple and brief, yet always containing something from which we can learn. The first letter from Seneca to Paul, greetings. I believe, Paul, that you have been informed about the conversation I had yesterday with my Lucilius. Lucilius was the governor of Sicily and a great friend of Seneca. Seneca wrote a series of letters to him. There is a book with that name. So, I believe, Paul, that you have been informed about the conversation I had yesterday with my Lucilius regarding the Apocrypha, or possibly the mysteries, secrets, and other matters. For certain parts of your teachings were with me. So, he recounts that he was speaking with Lucilius while having Paul's teachings at hand. He had already read a portion of what Paul had written. We'll see the gardens of Sallust, where, because of us, those whom I speak of, going in another direction, will come and join us. In other words, Seneca and Lucilius stop at the place, and people come to meet them, to take part in the conversation about Paul's writings. We certainly would have wished for your presence, and I wanted you to know that. We were greatly comforted by the reading of your book, to which I refer in some of the many letters you address to various cities or capitals of provinces, in which you instill moral life with admirable precepts. Understand that at that time, a book was not what we think of today, a lengthy, bound text. They were writings, loose writings, and they called the Apostle Paul's letters to various people's books, as was his custom to write. In other words, he refers to these writings as admirable precepts that instill moral life among the people. And in this, there was a common ground deeply connected with Stoicism. These thoughts, I believe, are not expressed by oneself, but through oneself. In other words, he says that Paul was a vehicle for something greater than himself, for a divine voice. These precepts are not expressed by oneself, but through oneself. That is, you, Paul, are a channel. And certainly, at times, both by oneself and through oneself. In other words, there are moments when he serves as a channel, and there are moments when he himself is speaking, expressing his own thoughts. For this is their greatness. And they are expressed with such nobility that I believe entire generations, ages of humanity, will hardly be able to breathe new life into them or perfect them. I wish you good health, brother. Do you understand what is being said here? Hardly will generations, ages of men, be able to perfect what you have said. So well crafted it is that it will be difficult to go beyond it. In other words, this is an admirable recognition of the beauty of the writings of a Roman brother imprisoned, with an uncertain fate, while he, Seneca, a consul, stands beside the emperor. The personal risk that this entailed for him. But the greatness of soul of a man who cannot help but recognize beauty, wherever it may be. He took a great risk with this, because he was bringing this thought, as he does here, to Lucilius, who is the governor of Sicily, the Roman governor of Sicily, to people in Rome, and even to the emperor himself, spreading the thought of Paul. Always considering this, if these letters are indeed authentic, well, see. Second letter, Paul to Seneca. Greetings. I received your letter yesterday with great joy, and I should have replied to you promptly, if only I had the youth that I wish I could wish upon you. Because you know when, by whom, at what moment, and to whom things should be delivered and entrusted. In other words, he says, you know to whom to speak, I trust you. And then you will notice, throughout the letters, in the 6 responses from Paul, a great deal of prudence. It is no coincidence that he was able to spread Christianity as he did. He was a remarkable communicator, possessed great charisma, deeply believed in what he was saying, but he was also very prudent in knowing what to say and to whom. He warned Seneca about this several times. Therefore, I am very glad that you have spoken about my writings, because you are someone who knows what to say, to whom, and where. I implore you, therefore, not to think that you are being neglected when I'm respecting the dignity of your person. Do not think that I'm placing value on this. Regarding the part where you, in any place, write that you are pleased with my letter, or write that you are pleased with part of it, I feel happy to be in the good graces of such a man. That is, Paul acknowledges that Seneca was a remarkable man. I am happy to have found favor in the eyes of a man of such stature, of such greatness. Because you would not say it, that is, you would not offer praise lightly. You, a critic, a sophist, the teacher of a great prince, and indeed, the teacher of all, you would not say it unless you spoke the truth. You would not lie to me by offering empty praise. I trust that you may continue in good health. Do you perceive the respect that Paul had for Seneca? Notice how a bond of mutual recognition is established there, through letters, through the exchange of thoughts. People who love ideas generally know how to recognize those who possess ideas. Those who have true, profound, noble ideas, ideas that serve as bridges between the metaphysical and the physical, ideas that are bridges between heaven and earth, however you choose to name it. It's a curious thing that, in the past, when I used to watch Western movies, I found it interesting when a bandit would arrive in a town and could immediately recognize when someone else was on his level. It seems that this is not just a playful trope from Western films. History works this way as well. Both the wicked recognize those who are as wicked as themselves, and the good recognize those who are as good as they are. It seems to be a point of affinity, creating a certain sense of recognition, and the great recognize those who are great. You can sense a profound mutual respect there between individuals who live in 2 very different worlds. Seneca to Paul, greetings, 3rd epistle. I have compiled some writings into a single volume, giving them an appropriate arrangement. In other words, I have gathered and organized Paul's writings into a volume, giving them a suitable structure. I have also decided to read them to Caesar. That is, he decided to read Paul's writings to Nero, if fate is kind enough, so that it may bring a new, interested ear to the audience. In other words, so that Nero might become interested in listening. Perhaps you will be there as well. In this letter, it is clear that he hopes Paul will be released, that Paul might join him, and that together they could accomplish something meaningful. If not, that is, if you are unable to be there, I will, at another time, set a date so that we can observe the work together. In other words, at another moment when you are, indeed, free. In fact, I could not show in these writings without first conferring with you. If only this could be done without risk. In other words, he says, I could not show your writings to the emperor without first speaking with you. If there were no risk, this would not be necessary, but there is risk. This way, I would know that I am not being negligent. Farewell, my dear Paul. Once again, farewell. In that moment, it did not have the meaning it holds today. Today, farewell means goodbye forever. Back then, it was just bye, see you soon, see you in a bit, or see you later. They always greet each other by ending with this farewell. Paul to Annio Seneca. Greetings. 4th epistle. Whenever I hear your letters read aloud, I think of you as if you were present, and I imagine nothing more than that you are always with us. So, as soon as you begin to return, that is, when you are released, we'll see in nearby accommodations. I wish you good health, brother. So, what is implied here is that perhaps these letters were not actually delivered to him. Did someone else read them? And he felt Seneca was very close. He hoped that as soon as they had their freedom, they could meet to share these ideas. Fifth letter. Seneca to Paul. Greetings. We are distressed by your absence. What is it? They probably did not exchange letters for a relatively long period. What reasons keep you away? If it is the anger of the Lady Pappia Sabina, because you abandoned the old ceremonies and the sect, the Jewish sect, and converted others, there may be a possibility to intercede with her, and she might consider this matter closed upon further reflection and not take it lightly. In other words, if you distanced yourself out of fear of the lattice anger, we can consider that perhaps you will let it go, leave it behind. And she might even forget about it in due time. You notice that, even though Pappia Sabina was in the wrong, she is treated with complete respect by Seneca, who still regarded her as a person worthy of respect. Sixth epistle. By the way, it's interesting for us to expand a bit more on the fifth epistle. Later on, Pappia Sabina dies, and then everything becomes complicated regarding how she died. Some say it was due to Nero's violence, others say it wasn't during childbirth, but Nero himself eventually concluded that she was not exactly the lady he had expected. Nor was Nero the emperor he had dreamed of shaping, the one he had hoped to educate. But at that moment, he still held on to the illusion that his emperor and his consort were good, and that everything would be reconciled in the future. Sixth letter. Paul to Seneca and Lucilius. Greetings. Regarding the subject you have written to me about, I must not speak of it with pen and ink, of which the first marks and sketches something, and the latter reveals it clearly. Do you understand what he is talking about? About the subject you have spoken to me about, what is it? To speak of my ideas for Nero? I cannot write about it. Why? Because writing leaves evidence. This could be used against me. Dear friend, the first marks and sketches something, and the latter reveals it clearly. Especially because I know that among you, that is, among the Romans, in your homes and within yourselves, there are those who understand me. But certainly, there are also those who do not. So he says, look, I cannot address this explicitly, because in your homes there are those who understand me and those who do not. Honor should be given to all, and even more so, because people are caught by the opportunities that exist to be offended. In other words, if I open up opportunities for myself to be offended, I might become a victim of that. That is, he is saying that prudence is wise, because people are caught off guard by inattention, opportunities where they expose themselves. He had a great mission and did not want to lose his life due to carelessness or a trivial lack of prudence. He says, look, be careful, let's take it easy with this. With this idea of talking about my beliefs to Nero. If we are patient with them, we will certainly surpass them in every way, as long as they are people who repent for their actions. If they are people of good character, the emperor and the empress, after some time, we will overcome all of this. And we will be able to overcome these disagreements and the tension of this moment. In other words, we must have patience, which seemed to be a great virtue in Paul. It is a great virtue in practically all great individuals. And then comes the seventh letter. Aenianus Seneca to Paul and Theophilus, greetings. In other words, the seventh letter that Seneca writes to Paul and also to Theophilus, in which he once again speaks about reading his letters. I profess myself truly pleased with the reading of your letters, which you sent to the Galatians, the Corinthians, and the Achaeans. That is, Paul's epistles to Christ, to the Galatians, and to the Achaeans. And may we all live together, just as you show yourself inspired by divine frenzy, that divine awe, that enthusiasm, the entheos, to feel the divine within oneself. May we all live together. In other words, Seneca envisions a fraternity of all people who experience this frenzy. This divine movement within themselves. For it is the divine spirit that is within oneself, that is, within Paul, and far above oneself, who expresses these exalted and admirable thoughts. Therefore, I would, consequently, be cautious regarding your other points of view, in which the brilliance of style may fall short of the majesty of the thought. Here he begins with all that characteristic perfectionism. Seneca, who was also devoted to the idea of logic, was deeply fond of logic and wished that Paul's writings could be as perfect in form as they were in content, so that he would refine his command of Latin and express himself well in all his manifestations. In other words, that form and content would always be in harmony. Brother, so as not to hide anything from you and later have it on my conscience, I confess to you that Augustus, that is, Nero, was moved by your points of view. In other words, he told him, when I read to him the beginning about power, the virtue that lies within oneself. Perhaps he was referring to your introduction about virtue. This is a point from the text. When I read to him about the virtue that lies within oneself, perhaps I was speaking of Paul's introduction about virtue, which he read to Nero. His words were these: that he might question whether a man not conventionally educated could think in such a way. I understand. We are within a context where the most educated man in Rome, who was Seneca, speaks with the emperor, who also received the finest education, about Paul, who was a simple man, who had belonged to the Roman army, but who, by the standards of a cultured Roman man, was far below. And it is said that Nero replies, then, is it possible that a man not so well educated could express himself in such a way, could be a vehicle for this? I answered Nero, that the gods often speak through the mouths of the simple, the innocent, not those who treacherously try to show what they can do with their learning. And when I cited to him the example of Vatinus the rustic, to whom 2 men appeared in the territory of Rheight, and who were later recognized as Caro and Pollux, and he seemed completely convinced. In other words, understand that, for Nero to believe that Paul, being a man who did not have such a refined education, could speak such grand things, Seneca draws upon an example from Roman culture itself. A moment when a very simple man, this Vatinus the rustic, encounters 2 men, and these 2 men, in fact, were 2 gods, Castor and Pollux. And these gods speak directly to him. He says, if in our own tradition this is believed, why would we consider it impossible? And with this example, with this comparison, he convinces Nero that this man could truly be inspired by the gods. And that man was Paul. 8th letter from Paul to Seneca. Greetings. Although I am aware that Caesar, even though he sometimes speaks, is a lover of our marvels, you will suffer not by being harmed, but by being admonished. He says, although I believe that Caesar enjoys these things, will this bring some consequence for you? Not a good one. You will be harmed or admonished because of this. In other words, it is as if it were a gentle reprimand for Seneca having let his enthusiasm get the better of him and having read Paul's texts to Nero himself. Because I think you took a very serious step by bringing to his attention a subject foreign to his religion and upbringing. For, since he, Nero, is a worshipper of the gods of the nations, I do not see why you thought he would wish to know about these matters, unless I am to think that you did it out of an excessive attachment to me. In other words, you, Seneca, took a risk because of your deep connection to me. It is very difficult for the emperor to understand something like this, which does not belong to his own tradition. I beg you not to do this in the future. That is, do not say anything more to Nero, for the love of God. Here he demonstrates great prudence, a remarkable sagacity and prudence. You must be careful not to offend the emperor because of the affection you have for me. However, his anger will not harm us if it persists, nor will it do any good if it does not. In other words, what is he trying to say to Seneca? The Empress' anger, whether it lasts or not, does not affect us in our convictions, in our strength, in our beliefs, in our divine ideals. Whether she likes us or not, whether she favors us or not, it does not make much difference. This is very beautiful and thought-provoking. What we hold most precious, she cannot reach, she cannot take from us. As a queen, she may not be angry, but as a woman, she will feel offended. In other words, the role of queen imposes upon her an obligation to greatness, but as a woman, she may still harbor her resentments and her jealousy. Farewell. A new letter. Seneca to Paul. Greetings. I know that you are not so troubled. For my part, because of the letter I addressed in this way, telling you how to present your letters to Caesar, just as, by the nature of things, by what he calls, certainly, to a distance, the minds of men from all teaching and proper conduct, so that I'm surprised, for I took this for granted, based on many examples. I'm certain that you were not offended by me for having told Caesar, for having spoken about your ideas. Let us then act differently. And if, in the past, anything was done carelessly, you will forgive it. In other words, I trust in your forgiveness. I have sent you a book on the elegance of expression. Farewell, my dear Paul. That is, Seneca insisted on helping Paul to refine his ideas, so that the beauty of his content could shine in an equally beautiful form. The 10th letter. To Seneca from Paul. Greetings. Notice this order, which before was from Paul to Seneca. Here, he wrote it in a different way. To Seneca from Paul, greetings. And he goes on to explain this in the letter. Whenever I write to you and do not place my name after yours, I am doing something serious, making my persuasion, my letter, inconvenient. It is as if he offends the other by placing his own name first. Because I should, as I have often declared, be all things to all people. That is, to be able to speak with all people, from all different traditions and ways of thinking, and to observe in your person that Roman law has granted you the honor of the Senate, and to choose the last place when writing a letter. Not insisting on doing things my own way, in a confused and dishonorable manner. In other words, when addressing you, just as I have learned to speak to the Galatians, to Achilles, to everyone, I should also know how to speak to a Roman senator. And I should know that my name should always come after yours. Farewell, most devoted of teachers. This is Paul referring to Seneca. Farewell, most devoted of teachers. Notice the affection and respect present here, mutual. Honestly, I truly hope that there is some truth to this, because it is very beautiful. And it reveals something we deeply need to believe in, mutual respect, even when people hold such different positions. A prisoner and a consul who serves the emperor. One a Stoic philosopher, the other a Christian apostle, from a faith that is just beginning. Letter number 11, Seneca to Paul. Greetings. Hail, my dear Paul, if you, such a great man, so beloved in every way, are, I do not say merely together, but intimately connected to me and to my name, then surely your name and mine, Seneca, will both be well regarded. Since then, you have been the summit and the highest point among all people. Would I not be pleased to be so close to you, being counted as your second? That is, considering you such a remarkable, such a great person, do you think I would not be glad for my name to be near yours? Whether in second place, first, or anywhere at all? So, do not think that you are unworthy of being named first in the heading of the letters. Otherwise, it makes me think that you are testing me, instead of enjoying our time together. Especially knowing that you are a Roman citizen. The position I hold, I would wish it were yours, and yours, I would wish it were mine. Farewell, my dear Paul. See how interesting this is, everyone. This man was a consul, an educator, almost like a second father to Emperor Nero. And he refers to Paul, who, from the perspective of social status in Rome, was nothing. He was a soldier without much significance, who, at a certain point, converted to a religion derived from Judaism, which also held little importance for the Romans. In other words, the social gap between the two, a prisoner and a man in power, Seneca was, at the time, extremely wealthy and highly influential. The difference in their social standing was immense. And Seneca refers to him and says, "For me, it is an honor that my name comes after yours. For me, it is an honor that my name is alongside yours." I often say this, for me, it is something very interesting, something I deeply envy. I know that envy is not a beautiful thing to admit. But I'll confess it to you, all of us have our weaknesses. And this is one of mine. Do you notice that the great men in history are rarely recognized by their contemporaries? They are recognized centuries later, sometimes even millennia after their time. How I envy those who are able to stand before someone great and truly recognize that greatness. A contemporary who can acknowledge the greatness of someone present among them. Such a person must carry a certain light within themselves, because otherwise they would not be able to recognize the light outside. We cannot recognize something outside of us if we do not possess it within ourselves. So, a part of that greatness was within them. There are a few such cases throughout history, but they are rare. In general, contemporaries are completely blind to greatness. It is only posterity that comes to recognize great individuals. Seneca is saying here, my pride, for me, is immense. I would like to be in your place and you in mine. Thirteenth Epistle. I skipped the 12th and 14th epistles, as we mentioned at the beginning. 13th Epistle. And the last one, Seneca to Paul, greetings. Much of your work everywhere is enclosed in allegory and enigma. And therefore, the great strength you possess in substance and talent should be adorned. In other words, you possess content that is like a precious stone, and it deserves packaging worthy of its value. And that packaging is the ability to express oneself, with elegance, with sobriety, with beauty in the Latin language, which was still something challenging for Paul. So he continues, I do not mean elegance in words, but rather a certain attentiveness, in other words, a bit more rigor in the details of your expression. Nor should you feel fear because of the memories I have of what you say. Often, all those things that influence such matters can corrupt one's thinking, and they diminish the strength of the substance. I know you might say that this does not matter, after all, but I wish for you to hold on to me and yield to the genius of Latin, bringing beauty to your noble words, so that the great gift you have been granted may be rightfully honored by you. Farewell. Notice what Seneca is trying to convey here. In other words, you have a wonderful gift to offer humanity. Present it well, with care in its wrapping. Form matters, we live in a world of forms. Deliver it in appropriate packaging. This reminds me of a story I always tell about a king who had a dream and summoned one of his seers to ask what the dream meant. And this seer said, "Oh, this is a tragedy, Your Majesty. It means that you will witness the death of all your relatives." The king becomes furious and orders the guards to punish him, giving him 10 machado de assis, a severe penalty. Then he calls another seer, tells him the same dream, and this seer says, "Your Majesty, what a wonderful dream. This dream means that you will live longer than all your relatives." The king becomes very enthusiastic. What a marvel! Guards, give this man 10 gold coins. When the two meet outside, the first one is furious. But you are a fraud. You said the same thing I did. I received 10 machado de assis, and you 10 gold coins? Then the second one explains, look, you have to understand something. The truth is like a precious stone, and in that sense, it is noble. It is a gift to offer it. But it is one thing to place the stone inside a box, to wrap it beautifully, to add a flower and a heartfelt note. It is quite another to hurl this stone at someone's face. Even if it is a diamond, it is still a blow. In other words, beauty and value must be presented to the world in a beautiful and noble manner. In the world of forms, the way something is presented holds great significance. It must be crafted as thoughtfully as possible, appropriate, and worthy of its content. That is why we strive to ennoble our character, so that it may be fitting and worthy of the divine content that every human being carries within themselves. And the name for this is ethics, a concept that is deeply cherished by philosophy. So, these are the letters. And there is an interesting curiosity here, which you will notice when Paul is judged in Corinth, accused by the Jews of having betrayed his religion, and of having created a new religion, a sect, and of drawing followers away from the synagogues. Seneca's brother is the one who judges this matter. Seneca's brother was Lucius Junius Gallio Annianus and a judge in Corinth. He responds to the Jews, saying that if there had been any harm to public or private welfare, if Paul had injured someone or caused harm, or damaged someone's property, then that would be his concern. But these questions and disagreements about details of the Jewish religion he could not address, since he was not Jewish. In other words, he excuses himself. He refuses to judge Paul, even though he is being accused by a majority, which was the synod of that time. It is interesting how, throughout history, Christians have hated Gallio for this decision, when in reality, he was quite fair and impartial. Religious matters, regarding a faith to which I do not belong, how will I get involved in that? Now, as for a crime, he did not commit any, therefore I cannot judge him. It is interesting how perspectives throughout history change, how things become more complicated. How could Gallio have taken any position other than this one? In fact, Seneca, in his letters, speaks of Gallio. Some letters are addressed to Gallio, and he says that Gallio was an extremely honest man. This is yet another point of connection between the two. So, what can we perceive in this whole story? What serves us? What is useful to us? True kindness is rooted in mutual recognition. Two men who belong to very different worlds, yet who know how to recognize each other's greatness and deeply respect one another, to the point of wanting to be together, to share their ideas. Notice how beautiful this is. Today, we so often assert our own ideas at the expense of others. We are always looking to challenge other people's ideas, rather than learning what is best from them. We do not assume that within every human being there must be something good. And we do not place ourselves before this person with the intention of seeking out that goodness. I'll bring it to the surface. Imagine the following, a simple little example, so that you can understand what I'm trying to say. Imagine that at some point in your youth or adolescence, you studied just a little bit of German, for example. And suddenly, there is a tourist in the middle of the street who only speaks German and is lost. If you want to help him, you have to bring to the surface that little bit of knowledge of the language you have, so you can offer some information to this man. And perhaps that was the only opportunity you ever had in your life to practice your German. Well, what a silly example, Lucio. What are you trying to say with this? What I mean is that every human being has a little bit of goodness within themselves, or even a lot. It varies from person to person. We are all a mixture of one and the other, as Plato would say, a blend of light and shadow. If our consciousness is focused on self-improvement as human beings, striving to become better and better, then anyone who wishes to speak with us, who wants to communicate, will necessarily have to speak this language, the language of human values, the language of self-development. And perhaps that was the only opportunity this person had to speak that language. Therefore, because you passed by, this person brought that forth into their consciousness. This can be a turning point, a moment of transformation. You notice that these two men possessed this quality. They sought what was best. And when they encounter each other, not in person, but through their writings, they recognize one another as great men. How difficult it is today for someone who belongs to one tradition to recognize greatness in another who comes from a completely different tradition. It's the idea of either being with me or against me. We claim to be the sole owners of the truth. Either you think as I do, or you are wrong. Those who came close to wisdom did not seem to be like that. They did not consider themselves owners of anything at all, and they carried within themselves the spirit of a learner. Another aspect is the humility of both, which we can clearly perceive. One constantly praising the other, putting the other first, both recognizing each other as great teachers, as great masters of life. This desire of Seneca to enhance the message of a man who does not even work for the same cause as he does. The desire to ensure that Paul's message, which aimed to spread a religion that Seneca himself did not follow, would become more effective. Would you teach someone to express themselves beautifully? If you do not fully agree with or are not a follower of the content that person is sharing, or at the very least, if it is not of your personal interest? I'll do. Seneca, upon recognizing the beauty of the message that Paul seeks to convey, even though he himself has no religious interest in what Paul preaches, still chooses to teach. Paul seeks to teach, to draw attention, so that he may continually beautify his message. In other words, he seeks to enhance the effectiveness of the other when he realizes that what the other does serves the greater good. Another point concerns regarding the emperor and his wife. You can see how pure was Paul in the sense of not harboring grudges or holding negative expectations toward others. Yet, he remained attentive to possibilities. He was able to forgive everything, but still stayed alert to human weaknesses, in such a way that it was not out of fear or a desire to protect himself, but rather, as a man of significance, a man with a mission, he understood that safeguarding himself meant giving greater breadth to his message, to allow it to reach even further. So, the prudence, the diplomacy, the care he takes, which at times may seem. Seneca even comes across as somewhat naive in comparison. It seems that Paul, from a distance, has a more strategic view of Nero than Seneca does, even though Seneca was almost like a father to him. I found this aspect, the virtues of each of them, very interesting. While one is an aesthete, with a great ability to work with form, the other possesses a certain expertise in dealing with human flaws, and the two complement each other very well. Paul's concern is to be understood by everyone, in other words, to speak a language that all can recognize without offending anyone's values. In Rome, a senator comes before a common man. I do not want to offend these values. This respect, this capacity that comes from Respicere, to know how to see, to look again, to truly see. It is the best path to reach others. Prudence and patience. Well, see, do we remember it in the letter? Well, see. At the right time, if you have a clear conscience, everything will become clear. This is not typical of a man who is inside a prison. In general, he is anxious. Seneca's ability to find parallels between Paul's faith and human values. Roman values, he even went so far as to delve into Greco-Roman mythology to find a similar case, to show Nero that a simple man can indeed be inspired by the divine voice. The ability to find parallels, common ground, behind different forms. A belief of Jewish origin, a monotheistic faith, within Rome, which had a completely different worldview. Rome operated with a polytheistic belief system, inspired by the Greek Orphic religion. In other words, there were no external points of contact. He is able to find these points of contact internally by reaching the heart of both perspectives. Only a person who has found their own heart, that is, who possesses a deep sense of identity, who knows who they are, is capable of finding the heart of all things and discovering identity and unity in all of them. Let this also serve as a very interesting indicator of this man's greatness. Ultimately, what I would like to leave with you is a message from these letters. We'll see or not, they were written by someone in a very distant time. I would very much like them to have truly been written by Seneca and Paul. But by someone in a very distant time, they were written. and this person understood this idea. Fraternity and mutual understanding among the good and the just. How admirable and necessary this is. As Heraclitus would say, those who sleep return to their isolated worlds, while those who awaken share a world in common. In other words, people of goodwill, each following their own path, tend to converge toward the same point. Fraternity, mutual respect, and the possibility of true understanding and a life fully lived. Among good and just people, among people of goodwill. When we grow as human beings, we do not grow only for ourselves, we grow for humanity. The more we grow as human beings, the greater our ability to create true fraternity, a fraternity capable of bringing well-being and fulfillment to an ever-growing group of people. When we draw closer to goodness, to justice, to integrity, to the fullness of the human condition. By finding our own heart, we discover a meeting point with all the hearts in the universe. This is the pursuit of wisdom. And this, which I hope has been important and meaningful for you, is a good example of hearts that may be distant on a social scale, yet are very close in their love for truth. And that's it, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me remind you, what do we need to do? Right, team? Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. All those things I always forget. I'm capable of reciting almost an entire chapter of Plato's Republic to you, but these three little words I forget in every lecture. Such curiosities. And I hope you will go and read Professor José Carlos' text, which is truly beautiful. We have an excerpt from it here. I hope you will go, get to know these texts, and truly enjoy them. And don't forget, we have our classes running in several branches throughout our country, with open classes held virtually during the quarantine. After the quarantine ends, classes will return to being in person. But this is an excellent opportunity at this moment for you to begin discovering this wonderful tool that inspires in us both love and wisdom, philosophy. New Acropolis welcomes you with open arms during this quarantine and always. Explore our YouTube channel and join us. We are creating a wealth of content for you during these days. Thank you very much, and a warm embrace to everyone.